I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
I am the fucking hardest hustler in the world. This is Savage Part 2. Don't tell me about shit. It's 2022 and I'm still a savage. Whatever I want, I get. Whatever I want, I fucking get.
Does he even know this footage exists? Because according to people close to the situation, when this documentary airs, this will be the first time Sean Diddy Combs, his legal team, and his inner circle realize just how much of his past is no longer buried. What was once whispered behind closed doors is now being positioned front and center, and the implications stretch far beyond him alone. This isn't just about Diddy anymore. This is about the woman who was there before the fame, before Bad Boy, before the power, the person who shaped the environment he grew up in. The person whose name is now being pulled into the conversation in ways that are making even longtime insiders uncomfortable. And that's exactly why 50 Cent's next move has everyone paying attention. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something and answer honestly in the comments. If 50 Cent is sitting on unreleased footage, should it be shown to the public or should some things stay behind closed doors? Drop your thoughts below. And if you want the full breakdown as this story unfolds, make sure you're subscribed because what's coming next is not being talked about the way it should be. What makes this moment different is timing. Reports indicate that Season 2 of 50 Cent's documentary project is no longer playing it safe. Footage that was allegedly too sensitive, too controversial, or too risky to include the first time around is now being prepared for release. And this time, the focus isn't just Diddy's public behavior, it's the foundation that was laid long before the cameras ever followed him. According to people familiar with the material, even Diddy himself may not have seen everything that's about to surface. Which means when it drops, the reactions won't be controlled, prepared, or filtered through lawyers first. And that's where the tension starts. Because one of the most uncomfortable questions now being asked isn't about music, money, or fame. It's about childhood, about environment, about what was considered normal inside the home where Diddy grew up and who was in charge of that environment. In previously released documentaries, former friends and associates described Diddy's early life as anything but ordinary. After the death of his father, his mother stepped into a dominant role, not just as a provider, but as a central figure in shaping social dynamics around the household. According to those accounts, their home became a gathering place, busy, influential, and constantly filled with adults connected to power, reputation, and the streets. People who were around during that time say it wasn't a secret. They describe a house where children were exposed early to adult conversations, adult behavior, and adult attention. Not hidden, not shielded, just present. And this is where the conversation begins to shift. Because the new material reportedly revisits those early years with far more detail and far less restraint, it doesn't accuse, it doesn't declare guilt. But it does place moments, quotes, and visuals next to each other in a way that forces viewers to draw their own conclusions. That's far more dangerous than a direct allegation. One former associate, whose words appear in the documentary, questions how much of Diddy's later behavior can truly be separated from what he saw growing up. Not because anyone told him what to do, but because he learned how power, attention, and admiration worked before most kids even understand what those things are. And once that door opens, it's hard to close. The footage reportedly includes past interviews, casual moments, and offhand comments that, at the time, seemed harmless. But when viewed through the lens of everything that's come out since, they take on a very different tone. Certain interactions feel more revealing, certain jokes land differently. Certain family dynamics suddenly don't look as simple as they once did. That's why this upcoming release has created such unease. Not because it introduces something brand new, but because it reframes what people thought they already understood. And notably, despite the explosive nature of these claims and implications, there has been very little legal pushback so far. No sweeping lawsuits, no aggressive injunctions, just statements denying inaccuracies and insisting that the narrative is being twisted. Which raises another question people can't stop asking. If none of this holds weight, why is it causing so much reaction behind the scenes? Insiders say this isn't about one clip or one quote. It's about pattern recognition, about how multiple accounts, spread across decades, now appear to point in the same direction, not proving anything but making it impossible to ignore. And as attention builds toward this next documentary chapter, the pressure isn't just on Diddy, it's on everyone connected to the story. Because once these conversations move from rumors to mainstream discussion, they don't go away quietly. They grow. And this is only the beginning. What makes this situation even more unsettling is that none of this is coming from one single source. That's the part people keep missing. When multiple interviews, past statements, and archived footage begin lining up in ways they were never meant to, it creates something far more powerful than an accusation. It creates a pattern. And patterns are what investigators, journalists, and viewers start paying attention to when stories refuse to disappear. According to individuals familiar with the material being prepared, the upcoming documentary doesn't rely on dramatic narration or exaggerated claims. Instead, it lets moments speak for themselves. Casual comments made years ago, home videos that once felt harmless, interviews where words were said without realizing how they would sound once placed next to everything else. That's where the discomfort comes from. Because when people talk freely, they often reveal more than they intend to. One of the recurring themes revisited is how early exposure to power in adult environments can normalize things most people would find alarming. Former associates describe an upbringing where boundaries were blurred, authority was absolute, and admiration was expected. Not demanded loudly, but assumed. And when someone grows up watching influence operate that way, it changes how they move later in life. This is why the documentary doesn't rush. It slows the viewer down. It places childhood anecdotes next to adult outcomes. Not to declare cause and effect, but to ask whether it's really a coincidence that the environments Diddy later created looked eerily similar to the ones he was raised in. The parties, the control, the expectation of loyalty, the blurred lines between business, family, and personal life. Those who appear in the footage describe these things as normal back then. But normal is a dangerous word, because what's normal to one household can feel deeply disturbing to everyone else. What's especially striking is how often Diddy himself has spoken openly about his relationship with his mother over the years. In interviews meant to show closeness and admiration, certain details stand out more now than they ever did before. Comments about her energy, her youthfulness, her presence in his world long after most parents step back. At the time, it was framed as love, as respect, as family unity. Now, viewed in context, people are asking different questions. Not because anyone told them what to think, but because the footage invites them to notice what they didn't before. And this is exactly why legal responses have been so carefully measured. Because challenging opinions is easy. Challenging raw footage, recorded interviews, and direct quotes is much harder. Especially when those materials were already public, just never examined this closely. Behind the scenes, sources say there is real concern about what happens once this conversation shifts fully into the mainstream. Not just among fans, but among institutions, media outlets, corporate partners, people who once benefited from proximity, now wondering how much distance they need. Because once perception changes, it doesn't snap back. And that brings us to another layer of this story control. Multiple insiders have long claimed that Diddy's empire was never structured the way it appeared on the surface. That while he was the face, the voice, the brand, the paperwork often told a different story. Ownership structures, asset control, signatures that didn't always match public narratives. The documentary reportedly revisits this, not as a financial expose, but as a behavioral one. Asking why someone so powerful would choose to keep certain assets out of their own name. Why decision-making authority was shared or deferred in ways that seemed unusual for a figure obsessed with control. Some point back to early lessons, to understanding risk, to watching consequences play out close to home. And when those lessons are learned young, they don't fade. They evolve. This is where the story widens beyond family dynamics and into long-term strategy. Because control isn't just about dominance in the moment. It's about insulation, about layers, about making sure that when pressure comes, it doesn't hit where it hurts most. Which is why viewers are paying close attention to how this documentary handles certain historical moments, especially events where responsibility was blurred, consequences were minimized, and accountability never fully landed where many expected it to. Moments that, at the time, felt tragic but distant. Now, they're being re-examined as turning points. And once again, the question isn't, is this illegal? The question is, what does this reveal? Because the most powerful stories aren't the ones that shout accusations. They're the ones that quietly show you who someone has been all along. And as more people begin connecting these dots, the silence around certain topics is becoming louder than any denial. This is no longer just a documentary rollout. It's a reckoning with history, environment, and the uncomfortable reality that some stories don't begin with fame, they begin at home. And the closer this release gets, the harder it becomes to ignore what's been hiding in plain sight. And this is where the story takes a turn that even longtime observers didn't expect. Because once you move past the personal dynamics and start examining the outcomes, the ripple effects become impossible to ignore. The behaviors people are questioning now didn't appear overnight. They didn't start when fame arrived. They didn't suddenly emerge when money followed success. They were already there, refined, rehearsed, and reinforced over time. What the documentary reportedly does next is something far more unsettling than making claims. It shows continuity. Viewers are taken from early anecdotes straight into later life examples, not with commentary, but with sequencing. A childhood story about exposure, then a business decision decades later, an early quote about control, then footage of how narratives were managed during public crises. Each moment on its own feels explainable. Together, they form a picture that feels intentional. And intention is what people are now debating. Former associates describe a pattern where loyalty wasn't just appreciated, it was expected. Silence wasn't requested, it was assumed. Those who stayed close were rewarded. Those who questioned too much found themselves pushed out, quietly and efficiently. Not with drama, with distance. What's striking is how often people say they didn't realize what they were part of until much later. At the time, it felt like opportunity, like access, like being chosen. Only years later did they recognize how tightly controlled everything actually was. This is where the documentary reportedly leans into psychological framing. Not diagnoses, not labels, but observation. How power operates when learned early. How admiration can be cultivated. How environments can be shaped to normalize excess while discouraging accountability. And the most chilling part is how comfortable everyone seemed within it. People didn't whisper. They joked. They laughed. They spoke openly on camera. Because when something feels normal, you don't hide it. You perform it. That's why so much of the footage feels jarring now. Not because it's graphic, but because it's casual. In several clips, Diddy is seen speaking about his world with complete confidence about parties, about access, about influence. At the time, it sounded like bravado. Now viewers are hearing something else beneath the surface. Ownership, control, expectation. And when family is involved in that world, the lines become even harder to define. Insiders say one of the most uncomfortable sections of the documentary is how it juxtaposes family loyalty with public silence. How those closest to him defended him aggressively even when the evidence was mounting. How narratives were redirected. How accountability was reframed as persecution. It wasn't just strategy. It was instinct. Which brings the conversation back to upbringing. Because when you grow up watching problems get handled quietly, consequences get softened, and responsibility get redistributed, you learn that power isn't about avoiding mistakes, it's about managing fallout. That lesson shows up again and again. In business dealings, in personal relationships, in public responses to controversy, the documentary reportedly revisits moments where Diddy appeared to deflect blame effortlessly, even when situations escalated dramatically. Moments where others took the fall, where chaos erupted and yet, somehow, he emerged untouched. To some, this looked like luck. To others, it now looks like preparation. And this is where viewers start asking themselves a different kind of question. Not did this happen, but how did this keep happening? Because systems don't sustain themselves by accident. They're maintained by people who understand leverage, timing, and optics. And according to those featured, that understanding was present long before the world ever knew his name. One former insider describes watching Diddy navigate rooms as if he already understood how outcomes would play out, as if he knew who held real power, who didn't, and who could be replaced. That level of awareness doesn't come from nowhere. It's learned. Often early, often close to home. As the documentary moves forward, it reportedly becomes less about shocking revelations and more about accumulation. Each segment adds weight. Each example reinforces the last. By the time viewers reach this stage, they aren't being told what to think, they're already thinking it. That's the danger. Because once the audience feels like they discovered something on their own, it sticks. And this is why the reaction behind the scenes has been so intense, because no amount of denial can undo pattern recognition. No statement can erase footage that already exists. And no narrative can fully overwrite what people feel when they connect dots themselves. What makes this even more volatile is the timing. With legal matters unfolding and public scrutiny at its peak, every new detail lands harder. Every resurfaced clip carries more weight. Every silence feels louder. And the closer this documentary gets to release, the more it threatens to reshape how the entire story is remembered. Not as a fall from grace, but as a continuation of something that started long before anyone was watching. Because when people finally start asking the right questions, the answers don't come all at once. They come in pieces. And once those pieces are seen together, there's no going back to the version of the story that came before. And this is where everything finally converges. Because by the time viewers reach this point, the question is no longer whether the footage exists or whether the accounts are real. The question becomes much harder to avoid. How much of this was always hidden in plain sight, and how much of it was deliberately ignored because the machine around it was too powerful to challenge? What the final stretch of this story reportedly does is pull the camera back. It stops focusing on individual moments and starts examining the ecosystem that allowed those moments to repeat without consequence. The friends who stayed silent, the businesses that kept profiting, the media narratives that softened edges instead of sharpening questions, and the family structure that remained intact no matter what storm hit from the outside. Because one thing becomes very clear, this wasn't just about protecting an image, it was about preserving a system. As pressure mounted over the years, Diddy didn't retreat. He adapted. When criticism surfaced, he reframed it. When accusations grew louder, he redirected attention. When legal scrutiny appeared, layers were added. And at every stage, the public-facing version of events was carefully managed. Not erased. Managed. This is where the documentary reportedly highlights something most people missed at the time. How often moments of crisis were followed by strategic visibility, appearances, statements, carefully timed interviews. Content meant to remind the public who he was supposed to be, not who people were starting to question. And when family entered the frame, that strategy intensified. Loyalty became a shield. Public unity became proof. Any criticism was framed as an attack, not an inquiry. And slowly the conversation shifted from accountability to defense. But defenses only work as long as people accept the premise. What's different now is that the premise itself is being challenged. The documentary doesn't claim that one person caused everything. Instead, it presents a much more unsettling idea that influence, when left unchecked, creates continuity. That environments shape behavior. That power learned early doesn't disappear, it scales. And that's why the story of Diddy's rise and unraveling cannot be separated from the people who were there at the very beginning. As the final segments unfold, viewers are shown how the past keeps resurfacing. Old interviews replayed with new understanding. old jokes stripped of context and heard plainly, old moments that once felt celebratory, now carrying an undertone that's hard to ignore. It's not about rewriting history. It's about finally reading it without distraction. This is also where the legal and media tension reaches its peak. Cease and desist letters, public denials, claims of defamation. All of it arriving not when the first documentary aired, but when word began spreading about what was coming next. That timing matters, because it suggests awareness. It suggests concern. It suggests that the upcoming material touches something far more sensitive than anything released before. And that's why people are watching closely. Not just fans, not just critics, but institutions, platforms, corporate partners. Everyone who once stood comfortably nearby, now reassessing how close is too close. Because once a narrative tips, it doesn't ask permission. The final moments of the documentary reportedly return to the present, to where Diddy is now, to how his sons are positioning themselves, to new projects, new documentaries, new attempts to reclaim the story. But the contrast is unavoidable. On one side, a polished narrative of resilience and misunderstanding. On the other, years of footage, testimony, and patterns that refuse to stay buried. Viewers are left with a choice not about guilt or innocence, but about belief. Do you believe the version being sold now, or the one that emerges when everything is laid side by side? Because the most powerful takeaway isn't outrage. It's clarity. Clarity about how power operates, how systems protect themselves, how influence passes down quietly, and how the truth rarely arrives all at once. It leaks, piece by piece, until ignoring it becomes harder than facing it. That's why this documentary matters, regardless of where you stand. Not because it tells you what to think, but because it forces you to look. And once you see the full picture, you can't unsee it. This story isn't ending with a documentary. It's entering a new phase, one where every past decision, every relationship, every moment of silence is being reevaluated under a brighter light. And whether the people involved like it or not, that light isn't going away. If you've watched this all the way through, you already understand this isn't about one man. It's about how power is built, protected, and eventually questioned. So if you want to stay ahead of what comes next, make sure you're subscribed. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Where do you think this story goes from here? And stay locked in, because this chapter may be closing, but the consequences are just beginning.